My husband and I walked into my mother's bank branch on a Tuesday morning in March and told the advisor that she could no longer manage her own finances. We used careful words. We said things like declining judgment and financial vulnerability. We had rehearsed those phrases the night before, sitting at our kitchen table in Toronto, genuinely convinced that we were doing the responsible thing. We had no idea that the woman we were there to protect had been quietly holding up the weight of our entire lives for over a decade. Before I tell you what happened inside that branch, I need to tell you where all of this started. My mother is 64 years old. She lives alone in the same semi-detached house in Hamilton, Ontario, where I grew up, a modest two-story near the escarpment with a narrow porch and a backyard she has tended the same way for 30 years. She drives a 2009 Honda Civic that she has serviced at the same garage on Barton Street since she bought it. She shops at the discount grocery chain. She doesn't travel. She doesn't redecorate. Every time I visited, I would look around that house, the same furniture, the same worn rug in the hallway, the curtains that had been there since I was a teenager, and feel a slow, low worry that I eventually convinced myself was love. My father passed away when I was 22. A heart attack at the plant where he'd worked for 20 years. There was no warning. He drove there one morning and was gone by afternoon. My mother handled the weeks after with a quiet steadiness I have only truly understood in the last few months. I thought at the time that she was simply strong. I didn't ask whether that strength had a cost, or what it had taken out of her, or what she had rearranged inside herself to keep everything moving. After he died, she stayed at her job with the school board, where she had worked as an administrative coordinator for years. A steady position, a decent salary. She sent my brother and me both to university. She attended every graduation, showed up when we needed her, never asked for anything in return. To everyone watching, she was a woman making ends meet with dignity and without drama. And because she never said otherwise, I filled the silence with my own conclusions. Miles and I married when I was 31. When we moved to Toronto, the rental market hit us like cold water. We found a 2-bedroom unit in the west end of the city, and the rent was significantly lower than anything comparable we had found. We told ourselves we had gotten lucky with timing, that we'd found a building before the wave hit. We signed the lease, settled in, and never looked closely at the ownership structure. We had no reason to, or so we believed. Over the years, I kept watching my mother from a distance and measuring her against my anxieties. She declined the trip to Portugal I suggested I could help plan. She didn't upgrade her car. She waved off any conversation about her financial situation with the same polite deflection she'd always used. Every small thing I noticed became evidence for a story I was quietly building. That she was stretched thin, that she was getting older and more vulnerable, that the gap between what she needed and what she could manage was growing in ways she wouldn't admit. Miles was cautious at first. He said we should be careful about overstepping, but I kept coming back to it, kept presenting him with the same accumulation of small details, until he agreed with me. We told ourselves that staying silent would have been the truly careless choice. We told ourselves that this was what it meant to look out for a parent who wouldn't look out for herself. We didn't speak to my brother. We didn't consult a lawyer to understand the actual legal process. We didn't call my mother first. We drove to Hamilton on a cold March morning, walked into her bank branch, and asked to speak with an advisor. Her name was Pauline. She greeted us with the measured warmth of someone trained to make difficult conversations feel manageable. Miles explained our concerns. He used phrases like protective arrangement and capacity review. He asked about the process for a continuing power of attorney for property, and whether the branch could flag her accounts for additional oversight given what we had described. Pauline listened and took notes, and said she would follow up with the branch manager before any formal steps could proceed. We sat in the waiting area. I felt, for the first time in months, a kind of relief at having finally done something. My mother walked through the door, less than 15 minutes later. The bank had called her that morning. A routine notification, they had said. Something about verifying account information. I hadn't expected her to be contacted so quickly. I had imagined more distance between the conversation we'd had with Pauline and whatever came next. I had pictured a quiet, managed process my mother brought in gently at the appropriate time, everything already in place before we had to discuss it. Instead, she walked in wearing her winter coat with the canvas tote bag she'd carried for years, and she stopped when she saw us sitting in those chairs. She didn't say anything. She looked at Miles, she looked at me. The room felt very still. Pauline brought us into a private meeting room. My mother sat across from us while Pauline explained what Miles and I had raised. My mother's expression didn't shift. Her hands were folded on the table. She listened until Pauline finished, and then she said, without any visible agitation, that she would like a few minutes alone with the branch manager before we continued. Pauline nodded. She and my mother walked out together, the door closed. Miles found my hand under the table. I stared at the closed door and waited. They were gone for nearly 25 minutes. When Pauline returned, she said my mother was still reviewing a few things and asked if we could wait a little longer. Something in her manner had changed. It was professional still, but quieter, more careful. Miles asked if everything was all right. She said yes, and that it wouldn't be much longer. I learned afterward what happened in that back office during those minutes. My mother had told Pauline there was an account she hadn't yet looked at. She had given Pauline the name of a trust she had established more than 11 years earlier, with the help of a private estate planning lawyer in Hamilton. Pauline had pulled it up. She had read through the records twice, according to what my mother told me later, before she said anything. When my mother came back into the meeting room, she sat down across from us the same way she had the first time. Pauline placed a printed summary on the table and indicated that we should read it. It took me longer than it should have to understand what I was looking at. My mother held a family trust that she had established in her own name, following years of careful work. The trust held 3 residential properties in Hamilton and the surrounding area, 1 duplex in the lower city, 1 semi-detached in Dundas, and 1 unit in a mid-rise building in the west end of Toronto. The trust also held a portfolio of registered and non-registered investments, including a TFSA and a non-registered account, built steadily over the previous decade. The total value was well above what I could have imagined my mother accumulating in a lifetime of what I thought was careful, limited living. I read the line about the Toronto property twice. The building where Miles and I had lived for 4 years was in the trust. Pauline explained, with my mother's permission, that the rent we had been paying since we signed our lease was below market rate for the unit and had been from the beginning. The difference between what we paid and the actual market rent had been covered through the trust, month after month, without our knowledge, without our permission, being asked because it was, in every legal sense, my mother's building and my mother's decision. Miles set the paper down on the table very slowly. There was one more thing. 3 years earlier, we had consolidated some debt through what we believed was a private lending product we had qualified for through our bank. The interest rate had been low, the approval fast, the terms straightforward. We had never looked too closely at the intermediary. We had told ourselves we'd simply found a decent product at the right time. The loan had come from the trust. My mother had arranged it through a financial intermediary, so that it arrived in a form we couldn't trace back to her. She had wanted us to feel the relief of the solution, without knowing she was the one who had provided it. I looked up from the page. My mother was watching me across the table. "Why?" I said. It was the only word I could manage. She said that was a longer conversation than we could have in a bank meeting room, and that she would explain everything properly at home. But before we left, she looked at both of us quietly. "You didn't come here to help me," she said. "You came here because you had decided what I was, and I needed you to understand what you had missed." The drive back to Toronto that night was the longest Miles and I had taken together in 4 years of marriage. We didn't speak for a long stretch of the 403. The highway lights passed overhead one after the other, and I sat with the printed summary folded in my lap and went through everything I could remember from the past several years. The apartment we had been so relieved to find, the loan that had arrived so cleanly at exactly the right moment. Every month we'd told ourselves we were managing, that we were building something, that we were doing fine in an expensive city through a combination of luck and effort. We hadn't been doing it alone. We had never been doing it alone. And while we had been living inside that invisible support, I had been building a case that my mother needed to be managed. I had taken her quietness and called it confusion. I had taken her simplicity and called it struggle. I had looked at her 2009 Civic and her curtains and her discount grocery receipts and decided, with complete confidence, that they were signs of a woman losing her grip. I had been so certain. 2 days later, the property management company that handled our building sent a lease renewal notice. For the first time since we moved in, the monthly rent reflected actual market value. The number was nearly $800 higher than what we had been paying. Miles and I sat at our kitchen table with the notice between us and ran the numbers until we didn't want to run them anymore. It was manageable, but only just. We would have to make real adjustments. The ease we had taken for granted, the ease we had credited to ourselves, was not something we had built. It was something that had been extended to us without our knowledge, by the woman I had gone to a bank to have assessed. I didn't call her right away. I needed several days to be able to speak without the words coming out wrong. On Friday evening, I drove to Hamilton alone. She opened the door before I reached the porch. She was wearing the housecoat she'd had for as long as I could remember. The kitchen smelled like something she'd had on the stove. Everything in that house was exactly as it had always been, and for the first time in years, I was seeing it clearly. We sat down at the kitchen table. She let me go first. I said I was sorry. I didn't soften it. I didn't try to explain the logic that had led me to that bank branch, because sitting in her kitchen, I could see exactly where the logic had broken. I had decided what my mother was without ever asking her. I had looked at a woman who had chosen to live quietly, and decided her quiet was a symptom. I had brought that conclusion to her bank, handed it to a stranger in professional language, and presented it as concern. She listened to all of it. She poured tea when I finished. After your father died, she said, people were very kind, but they were also very fast to tell me what I couldn't do, what I needed to watch out for, what I should hand over or let go of. They meant well. But no one asked me what I thought. They told me what they assumed. She set the kettle down. I promised myself I would never make the people I loved feel that way. She told me things I hadn't known. After my father died, she had spent years learning what she had never prioritized before. She started with the duplex in the lower city, a property that needed significant work, that most buyers passed on because of the condition. She spent 2 years learning enough about renovation and property management to make it livable, then rentable. She sold it at a modest gain, then bought 2 more. She had worked with an estate lawyer to establish the trust once the portfolio had grown enough to benefit from the structure. She had made it a practice to keep TFSA contribution room in her plan each year, to reinvest rental income rather than spend it, to build slowly and without drawing attention. She had never told us. Not because she wanted to hide it, but because she had seen clearly what happens when people know there is something to have a stake in. After my father's death, relatives who had offered sympathy were also quick to offer opinions about insurance money and how it should be used. She had watched the dynamic change the moment anyone believed she had resources. She had decided long ago that she preferred to move quietly. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me, she said, but I also didn't want you to struggle when I could make it easier, so I found a way to do both. She looked at me with an expression that I think about often now. What hurt me wasn't your concern. It was the fact that you never asked. You spent months deciding what I was. You never gave me the chance to tell you. Miles came to Hamilton the following weekend. The 3 of us sat at the kitchen table for most of an afternoon. My mother walked us through everything. The properties, the trust structure, the investment accounts, the plan she had made for the trust to benefit the family in the years ahead. She answered every question. She showed us the documents, and she asked for honesty in return, about what we actually needed, what we had been carrying, what we had been afraid to say directly. It was the most honest conversation I have had with anyone in my adult life. At the end of it, she told us that the rent notice would be corrected. The monthly amount would return to what it had been. Not because she felt sorry for us, but because she felt the 2 weeks we had spent with the real number had served their purpose. We understood now what that number meant. We understood what had been quietly filling the gap. But she made 2 things clear to both of us. The first was that any decision that touched her life, her finances, her health, her future, anything that involved her name, would begin with a conversation that included her. Not a conversation held in advance, without her. Not a meeting planned to present her with something already decided. She would be in the room, and she would speak, and we would listen to what she said before we formed any conclusions. The second was simpler. She said she had chosen her life deliberately. The car ran well. The house kept her warm. She had not arrived at her quiet life by accident or by limitation. She had built it the same way she had built everything else, with intention, and without needing anyone to know. Some weeks after that, we drove back to Hamilton together, and went to the branch where all of this had begun. My mother handled everything herself. She spoke with Pauline, asked her own questions, reviewed her own accounts. I sat beside her and didn't offer anything that wasn't asked of me. Walking out to the parking lot afterward, she said, "I knew what you believed about me." I started to respond, but she shook her head gently. "I'm not saying it to make you feel worse. I'm saying it because you should understand what happens when people look at an older woman who lives simply and decide they already know what she's made of. I never became less than I was. I just stopped announcing myself." I think about that almost every day now. I spent years looking at my mother and seeing someone who needed to be protected. I understand now what was actually there. A woman who had rebuilt her entire life after the floor had been pulled out from under her, who had done it without asking for recognition, and who had used what she built to quietly make room for the people she loved to grow, without knowing how much of that room she was creating. She had carried more than any of us understood, and she had done it in the least dramatic way possible, because that was simply who she was. When you look at someone and decide you already know what they are, you stop seeing them. The kind of worry that feels like love can blind you just as completely as any indifference can. I had been so certain I was paying attention. I had not been paying attention at all. My mother is 64 years old. She still drives the 2009 Civic. She still buys her groceries at the discount supermarket and tends her backyard the same way she always has. She is the most capable person I have ever known. She built something extraordinary without anyone watching, and she used it, without hesitation, to hold the rest of us up, while we congratulated ourselves for standing. We had gone to her bank to protect her. We had no idea she had been protecting us the whole time.